My name is Gail Sloan. I'm the CEO of the Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association of Australia, and it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all back to the third and final webinar, although Robbie and I were thinking there is one more on CDS, on EPR schemes in Europe. And we're doing this in partnership with Reloop, who we're very grateful to, who brought this to us as a concept. Before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the lands we're all on. And today, for me, that's on the Turrbal people, as I'm in Brisbane for breakfast tomorrow with the Minister, that I'm going to hopefully see a lot of you at. And I just want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Before I kick off, the video and sound, as you know, you don't need to worry, we can't hear you or see you, so don't worry about the kids or the dog. Screen size can be adjusted by hovering over the top of the window and clicking on the viewing options menu. We're going to use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Please, at any time that you get a question, don't hesitate to put it into the chat. I will curate that at the end with Clarissa and Rob, and we will be recording and providing a copy of this and the presentation to everyone who registered for this. This is really exciting for us because I guess we know what a good EPR doesn't look like in Australia. We've probably got an awful lot of product stewardship schemes that really don't hit what we'd hoped, but a lot of goodwill and a lot of desire to make them positive. It's great for us today to have Clarissa to talk about France, but also I think more exciting, or as exciting, is the most recent EU packaging rules. She's going to touch on that at the end, that Reloop has worked on really hard. I'm a big advocate, and a lot of us in WMRR are a big advocate for looking what's happening in the EU. We don't need to develop our own system. We can look at what works, and we can cut and paste almost what's happening there, given the amount of, I guess, trade and investment and multinationals that operate out of Europe. So we're also going to get a special check-in at the end about what's happening in the EU, that hopefully when we get to looking at new design rules and regulation of packaging later this year from the federal government as per the M commitment, what we get will be close to best practice, and we'll have the benefit of that learnings and all the work that's happened in Europe. So I'm really excited about that. Before we get to Clarissa, I'm just going to hand over to the Director of Reloop Asia Pacific, Rob Kelman, who's going to say a few words about today's speaker and get us underway. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And yeah, it's great. It's been a really fun series to work with WMRR on, and for all the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's really great. So I'm just going to introduce Clarissa. She's the CEO of Reloop and is Canadian, based in Spain. Could be worse. Clarissa is an expert on EU packaging policy and has been intimately involved in lots of the targets and policy setting over the last few years, and we'll cross that, and works with industry, NGOs, government, etc., for solutions around all these sort of things, and is also Reloop's lead on the UN plastics treaty negotiations, and I'm pretty sure is going to be in Ottawa for the next INC, I think, in the next month or so, Clarissa. So again, great to have everyone here. If anyone needs the recordings of the last two, which were on, we started with Sweden, went to Romania and Poland, and this one is France, then you can find them on, I think, the WMRR website and certainly on the Reloop website as well. So thanks, and over to you, Clarissa.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start sharing my screen shortly. Here we go. Okay. Share. Okay, so do you all see my screen? I think that's probably a yes.
Yes, we do. We do.
Awesome.
And you're on presenter mode, which is awesome. Kick off.
Okay, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all. As a Canadian, we're all part of the Dominion, so I'm sitting here with my cup of tea very early in the morning, delighted to share some experiences from Europe. So I'm going to talk to you, this is a two-part presentation. I'm going to start by talking a bit about taking a closer look at EPR for packaging and paper in France. And before I start, I just want to give a special thanks to the PRO, the main PRO, Producer Responsibility Organization in France, called CTO, because they helped me with a lot of the content for these slides. So very quickly, I just want to give you a quick background of the timeline. It starts over 50 years ago when the OECD adopts the polluter pay principle. So it actually dates that far back. Shortly thereafter, the European Union established the same principle in their main legislative framework called the Waste Directive framework. So it goes back really far. A full 20 years later, there is a French decree, which is basically a law, that puts together this organization called Eco-Emballage, which is a translation for eco packaging. And it was intended to provide some financial support to municipalities to set up collection schemes. It was not at all 100% financing. It was just a small percentage of what the costs were. It was in the early days. By 2004, however, there was about full coverage across the country where everybody had the ability to take their packaging to a bin and expect that it's going to be sorted. A few years later, there was a new law that basically said that businesses will cover the costs of collection and sorting. And that was a big jump because, as you probably know, collection is a huge part of these costs. So having to finance collection as well as sorting really sort of took the French system into a whole new stratosphere. And then in 2017, Eco-Emballage rebranded themselves to Citeo. And it was just part of this is a new organization. We do a hell of a lot more than we used to in the old days. And they wanted to rebrand themselves. And then in 2020, we have a packaging circular law, which covers even more than this. As you'll see, it covers reuse. So this is sort of the history of the system. I'm keeping a close eye on time. So we have an organization called Citeo. They are a private company. They work for FMCG store brands and retailers, because of course, retailers are also first importers of products into France, and therefore they're considered as the producers and they pay the fees. They have 350 employees. They're huge, and they are officially approved by the French government. So they are the primary PRO that exists in France. There is another one, but they're very, very small. They only have a super small share of membership. So when we talk about France, we talk about Citeo. And they do these three things. They organize collection and sorting, so that whole piece. They manage research. They do all the public awareness, and they do a lot of consultation with brand owners to help them redesign their packaging, understand how to make better decisions around packaging. And even now they're talking to brands about reuse, which is an exciting new development. They have 55,000 corporate clients, and they turn over about $1 billion a year. How does the money flow? It goes from the producer, so Citeo, producers send it to Citeo, the collective scheme. Then they deliver it directly to municipalities, and municipalities pay the waste management companies. Municipalities are in charge of waste management. This is an obligation in France. It's not like they can just shift that responsibility to the PROs. They are responsible to collect from their citizens, and they get the fees to support those services. And this text just basically says that they have the exclusive competency for household waste is the municipalities. So the next one is about the balance between costs and contributions. So this gives you a list of all of the things that are on the expense line of Citeo that they have to collect money for. So there's the collection and sorting, as I said, the R&D, eco-design, recycling, reuse, development programs. This is for things that are like flexible packaging, hard to recycle packaging. They have to do the R&D to come up with a solution for their producers so they can properly recycle it. And more importantly, moving into the future, there's some new projects that include abandoned waste and out-of-home waste. So here we're talking about moving beyond the yellow bin to where those materials are also showing up. And this is expanding the scope. In a perfect world, we want producers to pay for the entire system. We want them to pay for 100% of their packaging, irrespective of where it ends up. And this is part of that shift in France. And this is the 2023 shift. In terms of the contributions, producers, they pay by the weight of their material, but they also pay a unit-based contribution based on what it is. And it's a fairly complicated formula. I'm not going to put it down here, but know that as per the other webinars you've seen, they pay per kilo effectively. And rates encourage the use of packaging with a high recycling capacity. Obviously, since 2020, their fees have been among plastic materials to reflect the discrepancy of recycling rates. So there's been a lot of different types of rates for different plastic packaging. I'm going to show you an example now, and they're modulated to encourage that you move to a better package. So this is a typical example. This is like a rate sheet example only. And you can see at the top, the happy face is a very highly recyclable PET bottle that is clear colored. It has a rate of about 6.1 cents. I believe this is cents per unit. And then as you go down the scale to the nasty stuff like the PVC packaging, it's much more expensive. So this is a ever-changing set of fee modulation, modulated fees. And I should just say that on modulated fees, just a couple of comments. Yes, it is the way to go. In Europe now, it is required that all EPR systems have a modulated fee system. Of course, it makes sense. It's common sense. However, do not expect that fee modulation is going to fundamentally shift what packaging looks like on the market. If you want fee modulation to do that, this difference, which is about 0.6, is simply not enough. And of all the research that's been done on fee modulation, the final analysis is fee modulation is not enough to motivate designers to do a fundamental shift of design, and you need something else. So yes, it's important, it's obvious, but it's not going to solve the problem. Where does their money go? And they put together this graphic. It's really good, basically saying you contribute, we take action. This is €1 and how it divvies up. So it's kind of interesting to see. You could put a percentage here. So 44% of the money goes to collection, 26% goes to sorting. So that's actually pretty impressive because there's a lot of other money spent on other stuff as well. Typically, EPR in a lot of countries just really covers the sorting, let's face it. We're moving to covering collection as well because collection is the largest part of the cost. But now they're also covering things like litter prevention, R&D, other types of costs that they're finding ramping up. And that is even expanding to more things now. So this is, you know, we took you through that CTO evolution. CTO is one of those organizations. It's a very progressive country. They have very progressive legislation, and CTO as an organization is sort of ever embracing new responsibilities. This is kind of what it looks like. You've got these bins, pretty typical in the high volume areas. You don't have household collection. You have what I have here in Spain, where I just go down in through the building, and there's a bin on the corner of the street, source separation, to find all the different, you've got containers, you've got glass, you've got paper, you've got waste, and now in the future, you'll be having organics as well. But obviously they don't pay for organics. So big, quick result of the system, we're talking about 13 billion since they commenced in contributions. They have about a 72% packaging recycling rate. And now I should just note that in Europe, we no longer measure recycling as the volume of material that is shipped from the MRF to the recycler, okay? I want you to think about a bunch of PET bottles compressed in a bale coming out of a MRF. In the old days, we used to count that weight as the numerator over the total that is put onto market. And that's what this number represents here. But since 2019, there's a new calculation method which says, no. There's too much material that is thrown away by the recycler, where they take those PET bottles, the labels come off, there's losses, the caps are not PET. We want to measure the PET that is basically put into the PET extruder. Okay, input to final recycling is what they call it. So that has reduced all the rates, and I'll show you a full list in a second. So that now, based on the new methodology, their recycling rate is 66%. And they've, as a result of all the recycling, there's been a reduction in CO2 in terms of equivalencies. So they also have other targets. There's an ambitious target of reducing plastic generation by 20% by the end of 2025. There is an ambitious reuse target of 10% by 2027. And these are the European targets that need to be hit by 2030. And remember, this is the new recycling calculation. So on the right, these are the European targets for 2025 and 2030. Here you go, okay? Every European country has to adhere to these targets. On the left, you have their targets based on the old method and the new method. Now I wanted to show you, so you're really focusing on this block here. Plastic, there's a bottle here, but this actually represents all plastic. Flexible plastic, tubs, lids, the whole kit and caboodle. If you were to ask me what is the bottle rate, it's just 60% based on the most recent data. That's 2022 data, so still not very impressive. Aluminum is really, really low. And, you know, we have a lot of aluminum that is ending up in incinerators. Yes, it might get recovered from the bottom ash, but that's not really the best of recycling. So all in all, that's how they get their 66%. Moving on. The new obligations coming out, I mentioned it, they're going to have to cover out of home, away from home. That's going to be a very big cost. It's going to be a huge increase in fees. They are going to do some financing to pay for litter cleanup, and they're also going to have to deal with reuse. And this is probably the most interesting. So basically what it means that since 2023, 5% of the entire envelope of funds that are contributed by producers have to cover reuse. So what does that mean? I told you $1 billion a year, 5% is around $50 million for reuse every year. So after 2 years, we're at about 100 million. And this is their own kind of timeline. They're at 5 now, 5% reuse now, mostly beer, mostly very small localized reuse is happening. And they want to move to 10%. And this is their trajectory. And this is their budgeting. So you can see that this is like 100 million for the first 2 years, 50 for this year, 50 for this year. And this is how they're going to spend their money. They're going to be doing a number of things. They're working on right now, developing a range of standard packaging, bottles, and some packaging for fresh products and packaging for the HoReCa sector. We're talking about one standard refillable package that is owned by CTO, that is managed by CTO, and is there for their producers to use if they so choose. And then, of course, I'm just going to move on. You're going to get these slides, though. And finally, this basically is an ad for what they're going to spend the money on. If anyone's in the business of trying to do reuse work, this is interesting. They're going to take that money. They're going to use it on studies, on trials, on upscaling, on influencing. They are giving it to their clients to do interesting things. They're giving it to local authorities, and they're giving it to other organizations that want to do projects to support reuse. By all means, Reloop is going to be applying for some of that funding because we're working on reuse. There's a lot of money there. There's going to be, keep your eye on France. And the final 2 slides on France is to say that these are kind of their overall goals. So they're heading for that 75. They've got reuse targets. They want to ensure 80% coverage of all of the costs. As I said, they cover a lot. They only cover 80 though. And that is, it's an 80-20 split, and they want to do modulated fees. In terms of the responsibilities of governance, this is the ministry responsible in France, and they do all of these things. So I wanted to give you this list so you understand the different roles and responsibilities of the different organizations. And I'm not going to go through them, but you can see that they're like granting state approvals, monitoring, some administrative things around penalties. Obviously, they have to support CTO by issuing penalties to producers that are not part of the program. Very important responsibility of the ministry. And then this is also the more bureaucratic ministry, not the ministry, but this is the bureaucracy. And they work with CTO. They help to manage a fund. They also work to raise awareness, and they do a number of things. So this is basically the list of responsibilities. Now I want to move out of France, and I want to take the last 9 to 10 minutes to talk about what's happening in Europe. And it has been the most exciting month of my life. There has been an incredible amount of work done at the EU level. Now, reminding you, this is EU, 500 million people, 27 countries. Anything that EU regulates, all the countries are affected, including France, of course. So I want to put this up. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but this is basically a summary of all the targets. We talked about those recycling targets that we looked at here. Okay, and there's a new calculation. We didn't talk about the single-use plastics directive, but know that there's a 90% separate collection rate for PET beverage bottles in that directive. And that was introduced a few years ago. But what I want to talk about is not the old stuff, which you see in front of you. It's the new stuff. It's the packaging and packaging waste regulation. It's called the PPWR. And if you haven't heard it through the news wire, it's because there's still a little bit of voting that has to take place. But for all intents and purposes, it's rubber stamping. It's basically going to happen. And it should be officially sort of promulgated in early 2025, or even as late as the end of this year. It focuses really on reduction, reuse, and recycling. So I'm going to quickly fly through it. There's about 9 things I want to quickly talk about. These are the quick takeaways. The first one is just to say that it's a regulation. And in the past, in Europe, they passed directives, which were kind of had lofty goals like targets, and member states could do whatever they wanted to do to reach those targets. This is much more prescriptive. It's a regulation. So it is a first of its kind. And it's obviously when countries were confronted with this, they were all, discombobulated about, oh my God, and this should be our accountability, not their accountability. They shouldn't be making those kinds of detailed decisions for us. But in the end, it was put in because they wanted to make the market of the EU more harmonized, because producers were complaining about 27 different EPR programs that they had to comply with. They wanted a more harmonized approach, and this is what came out of it. So 1, it obliges directly economic actors to new responsibilities and targets. In the past, it was more like this country has to do this, and they went off and did it. Now it's actually targeting manufacturers, suppliers, importers, distributors. They are responsible for certain targets, as you'll see. Number 2, it sets waste prevention targets of 5, 10, and 15% measured against the 2018 baseline. So this is basically saying to countries, it's not just about recycling. You need to generate less. And that is a really interesting, not new approach. Number 3, my most favorite of all, it requires member states to set up a deposit return system for plastic bottles and beverage cans. They have to meet a 90% collection for recycling target by 2029. And the only way they can exempt themselves as countries, i.e. Italy, is to get an 80% collection for recycling rate by 2026. I'll tell you right now, no one's going to achieve that 80 rate. No one's going to be eligible for exemption, but there is a bit of cheating going on with data. So there'll probably, i.e. Italy, there'll probably be some countries that are going to fall under that exemption, and they're going to get away with it. But for the most part, most countries will have DRS by 2028, 2029. Number 4, all packaging must be recyclable. Now, that's by 2030 and 35. There's sort of 2 bands there, but effectively, you can read the definition on your own. There are a series of base requirements that satisfy, recycling at scale, You must be able to turn it into a new primary raw material. There's a whole series of criteria that have to be met in order to reach that definition of recyclability. So I would say like PVC packaging, it's just not going to be on the market at all, as one example. Next, you have recycled content. Very interesting, very huge. I'll just focus at the bottom here, all other plastic packaging. This is non-food grade, 35 and 65% recycled content. I want you to think about all those packages for household cleaning products, anything that's non-food, they're all going to have 35 and 65% recycled content. There's the PET one on beverage, which is a pulling it through from another law, but even 65. And we've done some work. If we get 90% in Europe and it's through a DRS and the material's clean, every single producer can hit that 65% using European PET. Very interesting. And finally, number 6 is a ban, PFAS. I don't even know how to say it, but it's a chemical that is put in a lot of plastics, and this is going to be banned from Europe. That's going to be very challenging for a lot of producers. Number 7, there are prohibited packaging formats no longer allowed on the market. Single-use plastic for fruits and vegetables sold in Horeca, beverage in Horeca, small shampoo bottles. I know a lot of you are happy to see that. They're out. People wrapping their bags with plastic at the airport, out, and polystyrene packaging, out. Reuse targets. Here you have them. I think the most interesting is the alcohol and non-alcohol beverages of 10%. I should say 2030, sorry, and 40%. It's more of an aspirational target. These were fought really, really hard. In the end, I guess you could say we lost. We got much lower rates. We also got a big exemption. I won't get into it here, but basically to say that there's a number of criteria that need to be met. If you want to be exempt as an economic actor by your country, you have to meet a series of criteria, but it also includes that that country has to be on track to meeting its waste reduction targets. So it's not actually that easy to opt out of this, but there are a lot of exemptions, like on transport packaging, cardboard's exempted. So it's really more covering those plastic crates and things like that. They want to make absolutely sure that they're reusable. And finally, number 9 is that there is a new obligation for takeaway companies like McDonald's to offer customers the ability to bring their own containers to be filled, and also to not charge them with it for that service. And then by 2030, they should be offering about 10% of their products in reusables. So now in my last minute, just to go back to France, this is what France did basically in response to the regulation, which I just showed you. They suddenly realized, well, we have a whole new slew of targets to meet as CTO, because we know the regulation is going to affect us. And here you have their new targets. So this is a final slide just to show you all the things that they need to do. It's reduction targets. They've got reuse targets. They've got definitions of recyclability. There's some labeling that I didn't talk about. There's a whole lot of new things. So it's really already, you can see CTO is, as I said, they're one of the best. They're embracing the new regulation and they're going for it. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. And we're half an hour in. I've made it on time. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Chris. That was actually awesome. And so I appreciate that. There are some questions in the chat, but I just wanted to ask you in relation to the packaging directive. And I love the fact that it's actually packaging power is the acronym PPWR. Have you got a definition for
Never heard that.
It looks like it just, you even got excited at the concept. You got PPWR and it's packaging power. I love it. I've got it. Is there a definition of reuse? Because we've been faffing around with trying to work out what the definition of reuse is
Yes,
in Australia. So we can look to that, right? Because we we have, you know, with our plastics definitions and stuff in all our states, of course, doing everything differently. You know, we've got reuse defined as 270 washes and all these sort of crazy metrics.
Okay. Do not do any more work, madam. I will send you
So
this.
excited.
I printed it out, although I'm told that I shouldn't have printed it yet. There are all of the definitions in here that you need. We spent so much time consulting all of the reuse businesses to nail down the right set of definitions, minimum requirements for a reuse system.
Yeah.
Everything is in here. Copy and paste it, please.
Awesome. Look,
This
you know,
is a Bible for you.
we're trying to convince the governments in Australia that they don't need to continue on the my is bigger contest any longer and could actually just learn from others. But so it's great that we've got that. I also
just to say, like, on this whole, like, you know, there's all, before this was done, there was a lot of talk about, well, how many times should it be reused for it?
Well, we've got that now.
So this idea of like 1,200 whatever, it's garbage. It's garbage. I mean, we've looked at life cycle assessments and there are a range, but literally, like, when you get to 4, 5, 6 times, for some packages, you've already more than met the requirement in terms of it being a much, much, much better package. So, you know, it's not in the hundreds at all. It's much lower than that.
I think the difference is, and probably because when you do that timeline and started at 1972, right, even though we started curbside and contained deposit schemes in South Australia around those times, right, we probably have not really inculcated it into our society as well, or got the producers so offside that they want more regulation yet in Australia. Like you've done a great job of agitating so much faster. It's all seen as a bit of an overhead here or a nice to have, as opposed to we must do these things. Yeah.
Yes, I understand that. And Europe is like far, far ahead. And you're kind of like, well, you're not as behind as America, but, you know, different regions are at different phases. And it does take a long time. Like, I've been in this game for 30 years. And I remember in Canada, we were one of the leaders on EPR. I remember the producers talking about EPR. They didn't want to have any responsibility at all. Whereas you go to Canada now, and it's just, they're kind of embracing it because it makes them feel like they're doing the right thing. So it's sometimes a generational thing too. Like, I find that the sustainability managers that are joining these companies today that are in their 30s, they're on board. Whereas the old buggers that are retiring now, they still aren't on board. They still don't believe that it's their responsibility. So it does take a generation.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I particularly love, well, there's many things I love about presentation, and Zach's kind of brought it to the fore of the question. You know, we have really big challenges with resource recovery and recycling when we have such poor design in Australia. And we know, for example, that labels and lids can often take up 10% by weight of the packaging, but we just ignore that when we do our packaging calculations on recyclability, you know. But we can't, but then straight away, if we have a bale of PET plastics with label and lids, we can't meet Basel Convention because there's 10% contam in there because it's the wrong lids and the wrong labels. But we conveniently ignore all of that in Australia. So Zach's asked the question, how is the input to final recycling? So that was, you were talking about input through to final recycling for now the calculation. How is that actually validated?
So great question. And we're still working through it now. Basically, the way it works is, if you, in a perfect world, the CTO would contact their recyclers who are bringing the bale of PET in. Let's say Indorama. Indorama is the largest recycler in Europe. So they get the PET in. They know how much was brought in, say a ton. And they'll also know of that ton how much was pulled off before it went into the extruder. So Indorama knows exactly, the recycler knows exactly what is being pulled off and what is going into the extruder. Just like a paper mill will know exactly from the pulper what is the weight of material that doesn't come out of the pulper to be made into new fiber. So the intel exists with the recycler. So the idea is that the recycler reports back what those tonnages are, and then that's how it happens.
So
However,
it's like internal site mass balancing, which we've got now
yes,
across sites, but yeah.
but, and I just want to say that Reloop was responsible for all this way back in 2018, but you had countries so we were really pushing for the new calculation because we knew that, especially for plastics, those losses that were being counted as recycled was just not right. And it was creating this false sense of achievement. So we fought really hard for the calculation. And then what happened was we had countries like Malta coming to us saying, yeah, but Clarissa, we're shipping all our stuff overseas. We do not have the ability to get that data from a Chinese recycler or a Turkish recycler. There's no way we can validate whether it's true or not. So we're stuck. So we came up with an idea called average loss rates, and it actually ended up in the Waste Framework Directive as language. Average loss rates are what would typically be known by experts as, yeah, this is typically the loss you'll get on PET, clean PET. You'll get, the pet industry says it's 30%. Okay, that's what they're claiming. The average loss rate on a bale of PET bottles is 30%. Those average loss rates are a derogation that you as a country can use to calculate your recycling rate. So you can say, well, we shipped from the MRF 1,000 tons of PET, but we shipped it to China. So we have no idea what the real recycling rate is, but we know that typically the average loss rate on PET is 30%. So we're going to reduce our number by 30%. Now, so that's an option that you have, is just to apply an average loss rate. Now, what are those average loss rates? Well, we know for glass, they're usually around 12%, but we collect our glass separate in a separate bin. We know for aluminum, they're anywhere from 2 to 10%. We know for PET, they're anywhere from 20% in a perfect world to like 40, 50% in a really nasty kind of mixed curbside system. So we already know what they are. Member states are required to disclose to the European Eurostat how they calculated those average loss rates. And actually, there is a regulation that is coming out called the Implementing Act that specifies exactly how to calculate those average loss rates. But I'm embarrassed to say that it actually hasn't been published yet. All these years later, it still hasn't been published. But it is coming, and that is effectively how we do it. So it literally is input to final recycling, input into the pulper, input into the extruder, input into the smelter. So yeah, there is, unfortunately, like labels on paper that are going to get pulped out, and they are going to get counted. But it was where we fell in Europe. There was, sometimes it doesn't quite fall right, but that's how it works.
But it's so important, right? Because it actually comes back to design. So this idea that we just ignore certain parts because it doesn't suit our methodology just is so frustrating. But also, I can only assume when you've got that sort of systems thinking and that systems obligation, that's why we start to see, because I remember about 4 years ago, we had some French plastics people out, and they're talking about how they do clear bottles, which obviously we all know if you do clear PET, you've got better recovery in the sense of cleaner stream, and then you can recycle more because we're not getting cloudy because we've got coloured. So they've moved to clear with PET full labels so that you can actually remove them, right? So you start to influence the design piece to address the loss piece. And I guess if you keep sort of segregating those and saying, oh, we're not going to count that, we're not going to count that, we're not going to get the change that we need to actually get the recovery we need, or the outcomes we're seeking.
100%.
Yeah, I know. But I'm just like, I'm banging my head, and I'm still banging my head. So Ron talks about the idea of standard packaging is interesting. You mentioned that at the start, and I'm assuming that's a video. So is it actually mandated, or I guess at least in France it sounds like it is, or at least you're working towards as much as possible?
No, it's not at all mandated. All they have is a target for reuse that producers ultimately have to meet. So CTO, the PRO, is tasked with getting to the target. So they came up with the idea. CTO said, well, we all know in our research, and we've been doing a lot of research on reuse in Europe over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, we know that this concept and again, I don't know if you guys have Loop in Australia. Do you have Loop in Australia?
They tried, and Tetra Pak, not Tetra Pak, TerraCycle tried the same. So Loop tried to come out here a few years ago with some of the supermarkets. It's the take back reuse one. Yeah,
Right.
it really didn't take off to the level that I guess they'd hoped.
So, you know, they don't do standardized packaging. They're very much about like offering a reuse option, specific brand-based reuse packaging. It doesn't work. The economies of scale, it's not scalable. So what CTO has discovered is that they realize it's not scalable. You need a standard package if you really want to do reuse with a lot of brands. So they've said one of the biggest problems with reuse is that what you're trying to get is a bunch of companies to come together and all share a package in a perfect world. But not one company is going to want to purchase the asset of the reusable package. You know, we've seen it happen in Canada with beer, but that's a coordinated, collaborative effort where they all pay in. There's an organization that's running the pool, that's paying for the new bottles every year that they all share. You need that kind of coordination. CTO realized that there's no way that one producer is going to succeed in trying to make reuse happen. You need standardized packaging. So they decided, why don't we do that? Why don't we purchase the asset? We'll be the owners of the asset. We'll manage the asset, and we will offer it to producers like beverage companies. Do you want to put your beverages in our standard reusable packaging? So that's what they're doing. Now, I understand that they are glass bottles, I think, for beverages. I think that they are looking at some other formats for other types of packaging, but that's very much where people's heads are now on reuse, is trying to figure out what is the best packaging format for different things. And like, you know, even grocery stores are looking at reuse. For example, imagine, and this is happening in Canada, imagine that you have the 3 largest grocery stores in Canada. They're sharing 3 standard reusable packages for things like nuts and lentils and dog food and grapes and raisins and lots of those kinds of foods. Imagine you walk into a grocery store, there's a plastic box that clicks. It has an individual QR code on it. You fill it up with peanuts, you click it closed, you go, you buy it, you pay a deposit on it. It's being tracked through an app. When you come back, it's got a QR code, you scan it, you get your money back. It's a shared asset. This is the thinking. This is where reuse is moving to. It's not the Loop model. Loop is too expensive. Like, you got to make reuse cheap if you want anyone to buy it. It's not like for rich, you know, eco-liberals so they can feel good about having their super sexy branded glass container with shampoo in it or whatever it is. You've
Except
got to
we
make
used
it
to get our milk delivered. Like, I'm so old that I remember my milk used to come, and then we'd put our empties out and we'd come back the next day, right? So we got convenient.
It's got to be shared. It's got to be shared. And, you know, I can't stress it enough that producers are not going to self-organize on their own.
Yeah.
They need support. They need targets to push them in that direction. They're going to need a PRO to help them. It could be their own reuse PRO. It could be their big PR like CTO, but you are not going to get reuse to happen unless you create an environment for it to happen, which is the regulatory infrastructure and some coordinating body to get the producers to work together.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Like, I think the pro we're very comfortable with, and we've seen examples of that with container deposits, our DRS. You know, my head goes to absolutely, you've got to have a system and potentially have to coordinate. So in Australia, do we need to think about competition issues in ACCC if we're setting up some sort of take back and alliance? But everything can be fixed, right? Everything can be addressed. We've just got to look at it. Zach had a follow-up, not to go back to the MRF too much, because then I want to go to Helen and her reuse, but just with a follow-up question about the imports. Do the MRFs have output standards? I'm going to guess it's a single bale of stream material, but
the MRFs definitely have output standards that are set by CTO. well, they're set by CTAO in collaboration with the municipalities. So it's part of the procurement contract that the MRF has to meet a set of quality control criteria in terms of, you know, for every PET bale that goes out, you need clear PET. It has to have no more than X% contamination, XXY. You need, you know, green bales and clear bales. So they have a set, and they're actually making it across the entire country. They are harmonizing the sorting requirements of MRFs. So one of the things that happens very often when you have EPR is that you have too many MRFs, right? Because all those municipalities built little MRFs, and they have like little bits of equipment in them, and they're only open for 7 hours. So, and this is very typical when you have like really strong EPR, it happened in Canada as well. The producers come in and they look at the whole infrastructure and they're like, this is totally inefficient. We need bigger MRFs with more sophisticated equipment. We need to shut down a bunch of MRFs, you know, stranded assets. What are we going to do with those MRFs? That whole issue, you know, it's a transition. It happens over a long period of time. And then you've got that infrastructure of MRFs. And in France, they significantly declined. I think they declined by about half over the last 20 years. And then you've got a much better network of MRFs. And then you can effectively have them do all the same things so that you've got the output of MRFs is consistent quality. And then you've got that consistency across the country. And then you've got just much more consistency in terms of making deals with recyclers, because they always know it's the same quality coming to them.
We've kind of gone in reverse. We've had sort of large-ish MRFs, 120,000, 150,000 tons, you know, and there's limits to what you can do with your streams between optex and all those things. And then we've gone back to post-China councils opening their own ones of about 30,000 tons. So we've gone in reverse. So it's going to be interesting to see where we go next. A lot of recent investment in MRFs. So I'd say most of ours are doing a good job of sorting with opticals to at least PET, HDPE, polyprop some. But yeah, we're in a different journey. I'm going to go back to reuse. So Helen asked in relation to the France, why is aluminium recovery and reprocessing rate so low in France?
That's a good question.
Is that to do with smelters and carbon? Because we have challenges with some of that here.
I think they have a lot of away from home problems collecting away from home, particularly in the big cities. Cans are typically consumed away from home. So there's a lot of loss there. It's one of the reasons why one of the CTAO goals for 2023 and beyond now is that away from home capture, because it's so terrible. So what happens is the cans end up going into incinerators, because a lot of the waste goes to incinerators, and they probably don't recover the metal from the bottom ash. Maybe they do, but it's away from home primarily is the problem.
It's all those beer drinking boys, hey? And then could you expand on the reusable format proposed by CTAO?
I haven't seen them. But as I said, I know that they're doing beverage containers and they're doing a couple of other formats. They're also typically, when you want to get reuse happening, you do start with the HoReCa sector. You know, you start with the bottles in the HoReCa sector because that's the easiest to collect back. So I don't know, but I will make a promise to you. As soon as we have photographs and a little bit more on what those standardized packages from CTAO are going to look like, I'll get them to Robbie and we'll get them through to you as well, because we're all quite curious about it.
Oh, so excited. We are so boring, right?
But France is definitely the one to keep your eye on, because they got all the money to spend on this.
Yeah, but they also sound like they've got all the bits brought together right under the umbrella of CTAO. So they've gone the whole hog, right? As you said, they're not just looking at sorting, they're actually looking at their design, the R&D, the whole piece, right? And obviously it's been seen by all in the supply chain as worthwhile. I'm sure it's not easy, but it's a lot more advanced than we've seen in a lot of other schemes.
Well, CTAO is, as I said, they are kind of embracing the responsibility, whereas typically PROs are pushing away. Like what they do is they go to government and they try to reduce their obligation. You know, that's typically what PROs are doing, is they're trying to reduce their obligation, reduce how much money they have to pay on behalf of their producers. CTO is slightly different. CTO said, you know, we know this is in the future. We know this is in the best interest of our producers. We're going to look at it from a long-term perspective, and we're going to recognize that we should do reuse. And hell, who's the best to do reuse? We are. And just as another note, you know, we may see deposit return in France, although the number one fighters of it are municipalities, which is strange, but nonetheless, if there is a DRS in France, and there will be, who do you think is going to run it?
CTO. It's just another scheme coordinator, isn't it? It's just another expansion of it.
Totally. I mean, and it's so funny because typically it's the PROs of EPR systems that fight deposit return as much as they can because they feel threatened by it, right? Because all those fees for PET bottles and cans are going to be removed from their system. And they are the biggest fighters. They are causing terrible, you know, they're spending a lot of money fighting deposit return. They're always the number one in the fight. They're at the front. Whereas the more progressive ones are saying, hell, why don't we just run it? We can just build our business up, like France, like Ireland. Ultimately, the PRO for EPR is going to become the PRO for the DRS, although they're going to call it a different name. It's the same organization. And this is also an interesting transition happening, whereas PROs are sort of starting to realize that, oh, maybe we should get into that business too.
It's going to be really interesting because we're kind of got the CDSs in almost all the states with their own, which is always important that everyone has their own. And then we're going to look at a national packaging scheme over the top of that and how it's all going to work. So, you know, we're kind of in reverse engineering. Nicole asked the question I asked about the competition issues with the shared packaging, but I think, you know, you don't have the same challenges because it's under the umbrella of the CTO, like whereas we might have competition. So, Helen asked, what do you think about the competitive pros in Germany and UK? I'm not sure UK is a competitive pro though, is it? It's not been finished. Versus single pro in France, Belgium and Netherlands, because I thought the UK have decided they're going to bring it in-house. That was the last I heard on their packaging one. But assuming, unless you've got something more up to date.
UK is still in a state of flux.
That's what I heard.
Okay, so this has been a fight for a long time, and I understand. Because in Germany, you know, what happened was the PRO got really big and fat, and there wasn't a lot of competition. So the theory was that they were just, you know, getting money from producers and they weren't even thinking about how much money they were spending. And then they brought in all this competition. I don't think the competition has helped at all, to be honest with you. In theory, it's a nice idea, but it actually makes things much more difficult. If you don't have some central coordination and you have a competitive system, you don't necessarily know how much free riding is in the system because you don't necessarily know who's got which clients and which ones have fallen through. And in some of these competitive PRO situations, like, I won't say like Germany, but like Poland, as an example, Romania, at one time, there is a huge amount of free riders, huge. You know, like in some cases we're talking 50% because there's no way to track who's paying or even free riders in terms of not reporting what you're actually putting on the market, reporting a lot less. And it's very hard, understand that it's very hard for a PRO in a competitive situation that doesn't have a lot of government support for what they're doing to try to go to one of their producers and say, hey, Coke, you say you sold 1 million bottles, but we actually think you sold 2 million. We want to go and audit you. You know how hard that is? Coke sits on their board. It's very difficult. So you need, if you're going to go with a competitive system, and I get why people want to do it, you have to have governments fully supporting you, which means you need centralized clearing, that the government has to have a registry of every single producer and who they've employed to be their producer responsibility organization. There has to be a reconciliation of the data so you don't have free riders. I would just say that I know this is a huge debate, but yeah, one PRO is better than multiple PROs. It's a lot easier. You need to have the proper competitive bidding processes in place, so you don't get into a situation where you have the PRO just giving the same contract to their buddies year over year. You have to have sort of transparent, open, competitive bidding process. Like that whole piece has to be in place if you're going to have the one PRO. But yeah, the best programs in Europe are the ones with one PRO.
I think no matter what scheme you go with, sorry, rub your hands up. What's really clear to me in all of these schemes that we've done is you've got to have the rules of engagement, the framework, all the levels of responsibilities and accountabilities clearly articulated and documented before you go to the market with any of it, right? So whether, and particularly with the EPR schemes, because that to be successful increasingly, that's got to be regulation driven. Government can't abrogate those things, right? So you've got to set that up from the get-go, or else, you know, it's very hard for voluntary schemes to go to mandatory without it. It's very hard to have competitive models without those clarities of rules. You know, government can't get away from that first supplier piece in order to make the schemes a success. You know, so you can't squib product stewardship, which is kind of, you know, our most recent attempts of $1 million here, there, and everywhere to the most random things that make no real difference. Kills me when you think about all the legislation went into container deposits and other effective schemes, right? So you've got to do it well. We must do these things well.
Can I just say something quickly too?
Sorry, Rob.
You've got the regulations in place and you've got a good governance framework. You don't need multiple PROs, because if the liable parties are on the board, they're employing the CEO and everyone underneath them, then that organization will be an efficient organization. You don't need that competitive environment, which does lead to a rush to the bottom on price. That's the risk around it, right?
Yeah, and I think when we've used competition with network operators, we're seeing good outcomes, right? But the scheme it's working out, and Alex Young's on this call, and, you know, give Alex his dues absolutely with what they did in New South Wales, in the sense of the thought and the work that went into upfront to make the scheme effective, right? You just can't avoid that stuff. Just like we're running out of time. Tara asked, and I'm going to try and interpret this, the CDO that develops and manages infrastructure collection and cleaning of, putting aside the standard packaging format piece, but do they tender that, or they direct deliver it, or is it under contract, all of the infrastructure? How does CDO go about delivering all the parts of the infrastructure collection, etc., for the scheme?
Well, most of it is through the contributions that they pay to the municipalities. So they move the money through, and ultimately it's the municipal competency. So the municipalities get that money, but they've got to make sure that they meet the requirements of CTO. So it's not, CTO is just an office with a huge office with a whole bunch of people sitting on their computers. But all of the work is ultimately the competency of the municipalities. So they're the ones, you know, building the infrastructure with money from CTO.
And of course, the standards that have been set by CTO, the inputs and outputs, which kind of then explain Nicole's question then as a bit of a follow-up. So how did France transition from council owned to what sounds like PRO owned? Well, they didn't. They made, I'm going to assume that they made some decisions about infrastructure requirements, and they funded accordingly to certain standards. It wasn't like they went along and went, you no longer own this MRF. So it's more of an evolution of the scheme. Yeah. Alex chipped in, which you're welcome to do. It's competition for the market instead of competition in the market, which makes sense. And then Taryn's asked me a question, and I'm a failure at this, Taryn. She said, in your experience, what strategies have been effective to get the Australian government to take leaders from models such as those for EPR that work well? Well, I can't really point to too many of those yet, but we're working hard on trying to point to things like waste directives in EU and showing what can be done and what could be done. And, you know, I don't know about you, Clarissa, but I always go back to 2015, I think it is, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Blue Planet or Blue Ocean, and they talk, I think it's like page 4 for me, where there's a diagram of where all the multinationals are domiciled Europe, and they make their material in Asia and they send it to the world. And it's like, well, if they're domiciled in Europe and they're following those standards, why can't we just have those? It just makes so much sense to me, right? You know, EU makes perfect sense. That the concept of banning PFAS by 2030 just makes me want to cry when we're talking about banning 4 of them in 2025. So, you know, we have a long, long way to go to reach those standards. So we're at the end of questions, and I really want to thank everyone. I could talk to you for hours, Clarissa, and I feel like we're going to, because there's so much in this space that's so important to the success of Australia. Rob, someone
get this. Everybody.
I will. And
get this.
The really sad thing is I'm going to read that. I'm going to quote that because, you know, we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, and we could just move. So like, you know, we have massive issues with batteries, and we have a battery directive that we can pick up off the shelf and adopt, right? Rob, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, it was great. Thanks.
All right. Well, Clarissa, we are so very grateful, and we will be keeping you on speed dial. We're so grateful for all the work that Reloop does in this space and the support that you're giving to broader industry. Thank you so much for getting up so early. We've got lots of fangirl comments in the chat. Nicole, Helen, Wendy, these sessions have been great, Rob. I'm sure we can find some more to do in the future. Thank you so much all for joining us again. I think we've got to stop telling people that they can get the webinar afterwards, because I noticed on the 3rd one, they're just going, we'll dial it in. So for those of you who are watching this who didn't turn up, you might not get to dial this one in. I might be mean. But we will speak to you all again, and have a great Tuesday night. See you guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.